Now back to the show. This is AM 650's The Law Show.
Welcome back. Good to have you with us this Sunday morning. Our guests in studio from Murphy Batista LLP in downtown Vancouver, Joe Murphy, QC, and Angela Price-Stevens, who is a lawyer and associate with Murphy Batista. Angela works a lot on medical malpractice files. Joe Murphy's been doing personal injury law for decades. We're going to talk about the Family Compensation Act, but I want to Joe, you've described the work you do at Murphy Batista with us on previous episodes of The Law Show. You boil it down to helping people get their lives back, or as best they can possibly do. In many cases, people arrive at your offices in pretty tough shape, emotionally and physically. Talk to us a little bit about someone who comes to you who's been wronged, either in a traffic accident or, Angela, perhaps by a doctor, or Joe, you mentioned it's possible that even they can compound on top of each other. So they're a bit of a mess emotionally, physically, difficulty walking even, letting alone sitting down in a chair, and they're mad as hell. They want revenge, and they want their lives back. How do you handle all that emotional volatility?
Well, carefully and usually over a period of time, because you have to get them down to a point where they're capable of listening to you, because when they're overly emotional, they can't listen to you. So you've got to do that. The really tough cases are the cases involving a death in the family. Mm-hmm. And the worst of those is the death of a child. And the worst of those is the death of a young child. Those are so terribly tragic. And you just sort of think, if this was me and this was my brother, my son, my daughter, it's just heartbreaking.
Absolutely.
But our job is to give them legal advice. So we have to sort of let the emotions settle down. They're not going to go away. Mm-hmm. Because we've got to give them advice and we've got to make sure they can understand what we're saying to them. But the damages that are available in British Columbia when someone's killed in an accident is very, very, very limited. And most people are shocked to hear how limited those damages are and how it translates into a child being killed, and the claim the family has being sometimes modest, sometimes approaching nothing.
Is this the Family Compensation Act?
Yes.
How long's that been around in BC, Joe?
It's been around forever, and I say that because I started practicing in 1975, and it was in existence then, or something that was the equivalent of it. And it's the only law in BC that gives the family the right to make a claim. If I'm injured, the common law, which is not the statute law, but the common law says I'm entitled to recover what my damages and losses are. But with a death claim, the common law says the person who's hurt could have made a claim, but they died and their claim died with them. So it's the family relying on this statute called the Family Compensation Act that has the right to make a claim, but this act really limits the amount of damages that can be recovered to the point sometimes it's almost nothing.
Okay, so let me use a case example, Angela. I'm just inventing one. And again, I'm going to Joe's worst case scenario, the death of a child. If a child, for example, is struck by a car and killed while playing on the street, that we have something called the Family Compensation Act that says if that family attempts to sue the driver of that vehicle, the maximum award is very limited, and that's all you can expect. What is the maximum award?
Well, the maximum award in an example as a child, I mean, you have to understand that this archaic act, which is and sadly was inherited or based on the UK law over 165 years ago, it's really designed to compensate dependents of the deceased, and it's predominantly calculated on loss of income that would have gone to those dependents. So in the case, for example, of a 6-year-old boy who gets knocked down, that boy himself is a dependent. He's not earning, and therefore it's not a viable case. Under the Family Compensation Act, there will be no award.
None at all?
Well, there will be very small amounts, for example, to bury the child.
I was just going to say funeral expenses.
Funeral expenses. I mean, you're talking. It's so small. It's almost adding insult to injury.
And there's nothing you can do about it, even if the driver of the vehicle was clearly in violation of some motor vehicle statute, let alone possibly drunk. The law says the family of this child, that person killed, is only eligible to receive X, and that's it.
Yes, that's how the Family Compensation Act works.
Wow.
It is almost it's a policy decision that the law decides that this is going to be a very narrow opportunity and very narrow range of heads of damage under which to claim. And the saying is, it's cheaper to kill somebody than maim them. And sadly, that's the case.
That's true.
It's bizarre. Now, Joe, does this also apply equally in medical malpractice cases?
Yeah.
Now, I was assuming we were talking about motor vehicle and traffic related stuff, but does it also does this act apply in medical malpractice?
It applies to any case where a death has resulted from someone's fault. So whether it's a medical malpractice, whether it's a car accident case, whether it's a child falling off something,
right?
The result is the same. And Sterling, what's interesting about this is based on a statute. And the governments, and I'm saying governments plural, have been lobbied for years and years, for decades, by groups like Mothers Against Drunk Drivers to change this. They say this is a bad law. Mm-hmm. This further victimizes the family of the person killed.
Definitely.
But the successive governments we've had in British Columbia have left the law as is. Ontario has a law that's similar to our law, but is much greater in terms of the damages that it allows to be claimed. So if I'm in Ontario and a family member is killed, I can claim for the equivalent of grief that I'm going to suffer. In BC, there's no grief. And in fact, in BC, if a child was killed in some accident and the parents needed counseling to deal with the grief, they could not recover the cost of the counseling because that's just outside. They say, well, where's the financial loss that flows from the death of the child? And the reality is, in most families, there is no financial loss.
No, of course not. As Angela just said, we're talking about a 6-year-old. This is a person who's too little to have a paper route, even, for crying out loud.
Or a 19-year-old.
Right.
It's the same.
Oh, okay. So in law, anybody up to 19 is a child, and that's that, right?
But anyone, a 19-year-old child is going to be living at home. Parents are going to be supporting them. Parents are probably going to be paying for all or some of their educational expenses. Yep. And except those cases where the culture says the child was going to care for the parents later in life, Vietnamese culture, Chinese culture, generally the Asian cultures.
Oh, right, okay.
There's no loss to the parents according to the Family Compensation Act.
Now, does British Columbia recognize cultural differences, or does this family compensation business apply right across the board?
The Family Compensation Act is a template, but it's up to a judge or jury to decide what financial loss a family suffered. And if, as a result of the death of a 19-year-old boy, the family suffered the loss of care later in life, then that can be recovered. So the law just sets out sort of the template or the rules, and it's up to the court, a judge or jury, to decide on an individual case what that means.
But it's also really, it's up to the plaintiff counsel to illustrate, to provide evidence to the trier of fact, be that judge alone or the jury, to paint the picture of what this individual, what the family has suffered as a result of this individual's death.
Right.
So yes, ultimately it's the finder of fact, but you require experienced counsel to be able to demonstrate the particular fact pattern for your client, and not just say, well, we're going to treat all 19-year-olds the same.
Right. Now, if it's fairly widely agreed by multiple parties who usually are fighting each other that this is just flat out bad law, and we've had social credit and New Democratic and Liberal governments all in British Columbia do absolutely nothing about it, we hear about activist judges, sometimes unfairly accused of writing law by themselves. Can a judge overrule this law? Can they say, I'm going to have to award something exceptional here, even though the law doesn't provide for it. The facts of the case are such that they demand to be addressed financially. Is that possible?
Sterling, the short answer is no. And if a judge did, the Court of Appeal would say this is the law. The decision really rests with the government.
It is a political thing then, isn't it? Yeah.
But what judges have done is they've taken the Family Compensation Act and they found that if a parent is killed, that each of the children suffer what's called loss of love, guidance, and affection. And the judges have said that's a financial loss, and there's a financial dollar value that goes on that. So that's really extending. It's a stretch to say that that's a financial loss, but the judges have done that. So they've done as much as they can to try and expand the coverage or the damages you get from this act. But the legislature needs to change it. The legislature should have changed it over the last 20 years, and no government has made that change. And I'm really perplexed why, because if you speak to anyone, they say this isn't right, this isn't fair, but that's the law we're stuck with.
Now, you, Angela, talked about this coming from British common law, and it's been in place for over 100 years. Have the Brits, Joe says Ontarians, now enjoy a little bit more access to compensation as family members of deceased children? Have the Brits made any changes? Clearly in BC we've done zip. How about the Brits?
I'm afraid you can't look to the British for any guiding light on this area, I'm afraid. Back in my dark days of doing defence work, I actually remember, and there is a place in hell for me for doing this, but I remember arguing, gosh, I'm ashamed to say this on the radio, that my client, who was the doctor at the time, should not even pay for funeral expenses because those funeral expenses would have been incurred in any event at some point in the future.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it's not a happy situation. So I do not think we can look to Britain, to the UK for guidance. But, there are a handful of states, in the United States, there are a handful of states that we can look to and find that there has been legislation that's been enacted that take into account the different perspectives on this, because the insurance people are going to be very resistant to anything that broadens the ability of a plaintiff to obtain more compensation.
Sure.
Obviously there's going to be resistance there, but we could look to the likes of Washington and Oregon, where they have come to more of a balanced view, and I think really that's what we need to be looking at. There are many stakeholders in this, and for example, the Trial Lawyers Association have a working committee on this, and they have drafted a proposed act. It's called the Wrongful Death Accountability Act,
which would replace the Family Compensation Act.
It would replace the Family Compensation Act, and it would also look to amend the Estate Administration Act. Not replace it entirely, but there would need to be some amendments to that Estate Administration Act, and to make it fairer. And it's really about accountability. Again, this is a thing that for me is so important, because if you can kill an individual and really not have to pay, it's sad, but money talks. When somebody has to pay out because of a mistake, funnily enough, they find a way of rectifying that situation so it doesn't happen again.
Do criminal charges affect this at all? If the person who knocked down the little child on the street and killed her, and the person was drunk and clearly in violation of several sections of the Motor Vehicle Act, Joe, would that color the outcome or the awarding of damages, given that a crime was committed first before the child was even killed? The guy got in a car drunk.
Sterling, it wouldn't, and if anything, that underlines the fact that the Family Compensation Act is not fair, it's not reasonable, and it's sure not the decision of the community as to how our laws should be.
Interesting
but
stuff.
We're stuck with it until a government changes it.
But it's good to know, and that's part of why we do the Law Show every Sunday. We don't always get real happy about some of the things we learn, but it's important to know what's going on out there, and this is clearly one area of British Columbia law that needs a little attention. Our guests are from Murphy Batista, LLP, Joe Murphy, QC, and Angela Price-Stevens. We'll be back with more on The Law Show after this quick timeout.
There's more of the show still ahead. This is AM 650's The Law Show.